Hey everybody, I hope we're ready to start a legit lecture. You will see that this week I've actually broken lectures up into two. These topics could take a lot of time, and I do not want to overwhelm you guys with too much that you have to take in. All right, so there are two lectures for the quiz this week. You will need to watch them both. Okay, so the quiz doesn't just cover one or the other, it covers both. So make sure you watch them both before taking the quiz. It's going to help you, obviously. Okay, so for this lecture, what we're going to talk about is senses. Okay, and when you hear senses, you probably think of vision, taste, hearing, but there's so many more. Okay, and we'll get to the vision, the tasting, and the hearing. And the next one of those guys are called special senses. All right, but first we're going to start talking about, you know, normal, just plain senses, you can say, and exactly how they are occurring, even though you don't even know they're occurring. So, sensation, okay, it is the conscious or sometimes subconscious awareness that your environment is changing. All right, whether it's internal changing, your organs are changing, your cell populations are changing, or external. Okay, so temperature's changing. Um, you feel pain. All right, so that is sensation. All right, as you are watching this, as you are touching your notepad, as you're writing, you're feeling a sensation. Okay. Now, the type of response, though, that's generated, that's going to depend on what sensory nerves travel to the central nervous system, right? And each part of the central nervous system does a couple things that the other one may not do. Okay, so for instance, the spinal cord, that's your simple reflexes, your stretch reflexes. Brainstem, that's more of your autonomic reflexes. So stuff you're not really aware that's going, it's just automatically going. So like your heart rate, right? You don't want to sit there and think about your heart rate. So that's what the brainstem helps to do. Now, the cerebral cortex, that's more of your conscious awareness. Okay, so being aware of something and adapting as such, okay, or having a sensation to something that you're aware of. And sensation is not the same as perception. Okay, sometimes the words used interchangeably, they are not the same. Right? Perception is the conscious interpretation of those sensations, right? So that is your ability to receive this sensation and understand the sensation and then furthermore respond to the sensation. Okay, and this will mostly occur in your cerebral cortex. Okay, and I mean, some of it will never reach the cortex, so it's not really consciously perceived. For instance, we do not know our blood pressure is being regulated. All right, it's just a non-conscious thing we don't think about. Okay, but it's still a perception because there is a sensation our body is seeing. Our body itself is seeing the perception of it and then going forth to regulate our blood pressure, for instance. Sensory modalities. Okay, so a sensory modality, that's a distinct type of sensation. All right, your touch, your pain, your vision. Okay, each sensory neuron, all right, specific neuron, carries the information that you have from one modality to the other or to the central nervous system. Okay, and this is what the brain starts to interpret. Okay, the sensation is based on whatever pathway or destination it's going to. It's not so much identifying the stimulus in a sense. It's more so responding to the messenger that's coming, right, or the location the messenger may be going to. And there's two classes of these guys. Okay, there's your general senses, your special senses. Okay, special senses, what I mentioned in the beginning, your smell, taste, vision, hearing, and equilibrium. Now, what we're going to talk about is general senses. All right, so you somatic and visceral sensations. You understand somatic is your thermal detection, pain, tactile, touch. Visceral is your internal organs, that you mostly don't know what's going on, subconscious. Stretch chemicals. If you're hungry, obviously that's a little conscious. But the pressure, so that's more of your subconscious sensations from internal environment, whereas somatic is external environment. So sensation has a distinct kind of process it goes through, right? First thing that happens is a sensory receptor becomes stimulated. Okay, and that is exactly as it sounds. It's a receptor that receives a certain sensory. Okay, you have sensory receptors in your skin that will detect temperature changes, that detect pressure by touch. Okay, and when they are stimulated, okay, it then goes through down into transduction through the receptors field. Okay, and that sensory receptor converts whatever stimulus, okay, into a graded potential. All right, so we're all there's electricity. Okay, so now transduction is starting that process, starting to make that battery power system go. All right, and now graded potentials, those vary in size, all based on stimulus strength. Okay, if super light touching of something, maybe your pencil right now, that is a low graded potential. Okay, you still know it's occurring. There's still transduction occurring because you're telling your brain, I'm holding my pencil, but maybe you break your pencil. Okay, you break your pencil, and out of frustration, you start to grab the pencil harder. Right, that is a larger graded potential. You're starting to feel an increase in the stimulus or the touch. And now, sensory receptors, like I said, mostly just receptors for sensories. These are actually specialized cells. Okay, often neurons, dendrites, all right? And they all respond normally to one specific type of stimulus. There are certain instances where they can respond to several, okay, but most commonly they're going to respond to one specific type, such as thermal ones will respond to heat or cold. All right, and that's sense, okay, whether it's touch, thermo, that helps to activate the receptor's receptive field, which then gets the whole starting idea of once I get in the transduction, my body is going to figure out what's going on because it's going to go down a specific pathway. All right, the energy is going to flow down a specific way to get to where it's got to be. Now, once transduction is done, it starts to generate the nerve impulses. All right, so transduction is getting that energy. All right, it's getting that gradient potential, but now we actually have to generate those nerve impulses. And like I said, we're nothing but just electricity. Okay, so our nerves start to contract, they start to impulse with one another, but it has to hit a threshold. All right, so that gradient potential has to reach a threshold. You're touching stuff, okay, but sometimes you don't realize it subconsciously, or your body just doesn't recognize it because that potential is not reaching a threshold where it can actually move forward. All right, when it's moving forward, it's called action potentials. Okay, action potentials are when you're over that threshold. Okay, and sensory neurons carry those impulses to whatever area it has to go in the central nervous system. So this makes them first order neurons, and we'll see what first order, secondary, tertiary order ones are in a bit. Okay. And now the electricity, the impulses, it's starting to flow. It's going its way to where it needs to be. So now it starts to integrate the input from the senses that it's getting. Right? Your central nervous system starts to process and it interprets the information. There's no sense for you to have these receptors, no sense for this whole thing to occur if your brain can't interpret what's occurring and respond accordingly. All right. And like I said, it's either conscious or it's unconscious. Conscious occurs in the cerebral cortex. And normally the brain's going to localize those sensations based on the specific region that is activated. Okay. Now to put it into kind of a picture and how it goes, you have first, like I said, stimulation of sensory receptor. All right. For this instance, it is your fingers out and you get pricked. All right? What occurs is sensory receptor absorbs it. Okay, it starts to make it into energy, which therefore makes it into a graded potential. Now that graded potential helps the transduction of the stimulus. So it helps to generate that graded potential to a point to where it's starting to make the energy. And once it makes enough energy, okay, or goes over that graded potential threshold, it hits the generation of the nerve impulses. So remember, it's generating graded potential in 2, but when it gets to 3 here, it's become an action potential. It's finally taking action because it's over the threshold. And once that action potential hits and you start to have nerve impulses, that's when it starts to kind of channel up your network of neurons, right? So all throughout our body and making its way to the central nervous system. And that there is when it starts to integrate itself. Okay, it finds its way to the cerebral cortex and it starts to interpret, okay, I'm putting my finger pressure on this. I have, heat touching my skin. And what occurs is the brain then will shoot out that message to whatever specific region of the brain is in charge of that response. Right? Think of your brain as an army base. It's going to give the order out to the base to which one has to go. Okay? So the cerebral cortex is kind of there to start the whole process. Going a little deeper into sensory receptors, okay, they're specialized structures, right? And the whole goal is to detect stimuli. They are the first thing that is there when you have senses. Okay, you just don't realize your body's covered in them. All right, different types as well, and it all has to be interpreted in a specific manner. Okay, and it's got to be done in a regulated manner so that it gets to the central nervous system. All right, this is when you got disorders where people, for instance, can't feel pain. All right, so it's all down to an electrosignaling as well as the receptor damage. Now they can be classified on a few things. All right, their microscopic structure, where they're located, whatever the origin of the stimulus is, and the type of stimulus that's detected. Looking at the microscopic structure first, they have free nerve endings. Okay, so those are just bare dendrites of the first order sensory neurons. So the ones that get that first message, that first impulse. They lack any visible structural specialization, but more importantly, they can help detect things that are touch sensations, right? Your pain, temperature changes, itch, tickle, anything you have that is touch related, free nerve endings are there to help. And another side, instead of just free nerve endings, is encapsulated nerve endings. Okay, so those are dendrites, they're enclosed this time, and that's in connective tissue. So if you remember a long, long time ago in your anatomy phase 1, connective tissue is just this tissue full of different cells, full of collagen, actin, other types of this harder, stiffer type proteins. Okay, so these nerve endings, they're actually surrounded by that. Right? Little capsules forming, hence the name encapsulated. And this actually helps to enhance sensitivity or specificity. And while the last one had touch sensation, this one does sometimes. Okay, but it's really helpful when you're detecting pressure or vibration. So the vibration when you hear something banging, your hands are on the table. Okay, that helps with detecting the vibration. Now, the third one is specialized sensory cells. Now, sometimes they're called separate sensory cells, but these guys, they form synapses with first order sensory neurons. Okay, so they're not so much the first order sensory neuron, it's just that they're there to basically receive a message from them. Okay, so basically like a handshake from those first sensory neurons. The synapse is the handshake relaying the message. And this is mostly in some special senses. Okay, so hearing, equilibrium, taste, vision, and all that we will get to in the next lecture. Okay, but just know that these guys are more so associated with special senses. Now, moving on, location and the origin of the stimuli, those are important. All right, so we We want to be able to taste with our tongue, right? We want to be able to smell with our nose. We want to be able to see with our eyes. So location and origin are key, and as such, they became a way to identify it. Exteroceptors, that's your near body surface, all right? So like your skin, okay? Your outer portions, your scalp, everything, all right, that detects the stimuli from an external environment. Right? So external. That's your touch, all your vibration, smell, taste, all that, anything on the outside. Now, interoceptors, we start to go on the inside. We start to look at internal conditions. Now, these guys will monitor internal conditions, and they're all throughout the body. Right? Organs, your nervous tissue, blood vessels, and they're usually subconscious. Like I said, you don't want to have to be sitting there thinking, "Oh, I need to, have my heartbeat." These receptors help to monitor that in a subconscious manner, and they can produce sensations of pain or pressure during strong stimulation. That's, for instance, why you have muscle stitches if you're running. You go out, your stomach's just dying, you're on the ground heaving. This is a strong sensation that's caused by these receptors being overstimulated. And the last ones, proprioceptors, these are more so in your muscles, tendons, and joints. So they're more in a specific area. Okay. And they do a specific thing. And they're telling you what your body position is. Obviously, this is in a kind of subconscious and conscious way, depending on what its job's doing. I'm sitting up straight in my chair right now, or I'm hunching over in my chair taking notes. Your muscle length, any type of joint movement, your balance, but it's all in those muscles, tendons, and joints to help you do that. All right, so those are more in a specialized region. Type of stimulus. Like I said way back, type of stimulus is big, right? We have those receptors that will detect a certain thing, some detect most ones, and as such, we classify them as that. Your mechanoreceptors, that's touch, pressure, vibration, all that, hearing, equilibrium, stretch. This is the most diverse, right? These guys are in your ear, they're in your skin, all right? Some of them are under your skin, they're in your muscles. These are probably the most versatile when it comes to doing a job. All right, the thermoreceptors, that's exactly as you would expect. Temperature changes, all right, not just on your skin, but inside. All right, they help with the response of you getting a fever to try and control the fever. All right, they send specific signals. Nociceptors, those are painful. All right, so if you have tissue damage, if any type of pain, these are the little buggers that cause it. Photoreceptors, I'm sure you've heard about when you talked about senses long time ago, and that's helps to kind of look at light, understand it, and process it, which gives you your vision. Chemoreceptors, that's pretty straightforward. That's chemicals, and they're again in a lot of places. Your taste buds have them, right? That's how you taste a lot of sour and sweet stuff like that. And they actually help us smell too, because the majority of your smell is kind of like taste buds. Right? You're getting some type of chemical response. And now one that really is more so involuntary is osmoreceptors. So that messes with osmotic pressure, all right, of the bodily fluids. So that one's more so just strictly subconscious. All right, we don't think about that. And as we talked in the beginning, the whole sensory pathway, how it occurs, we just discussed the sensory receptors. Now we're getting into the potential of the receptors, the transmission of the signal, that transduction region, right? So your sensory receptors, they've gone, they generated a receptor potential. Also, I refer to it as graded potential. And now they're going on to the next step. And now the stimulus and how this graded potential is done, how large it is, that's all dependent on two things: intensity of the stimulus, like I said, grabbing your pencil really hard, and the size of receptor potential. Certain regions of your body have, tons of receptors. Your hands, for instance, you have tons of touch receptors and mechanoreceptors so that you can feel things when touching them, right? But there's regions that don't. And so it's not so focused on the touch capability. So not only is it intensity that can mess with graded potential, but it's the size of the potential. And larger receptor potentials, they allow it to reach a threshold more easily. Since they reach that threshold more easily, they can go into action, threat, and then do their job, right? Start going down that line again. And they produce the higher frequencies of action potentials as such. Okay, so not only does it get it to go over the hill, but it's going to get it to go over the hill faster and more times. And once this is occurring, action potentials have done its job. We start to get into signal pathways. Now, I'm sure you've all talked about signal pathways in ANP1. All right, it's just a pathway done by various signaling, whether it be a chemical based or interaction with other cells. But when it comes to this stuff, those free or encapsulated endings, they start to direct the action potentials, right? They're, like I said, they're that first response, first neurons. And the separate sensory cells, those are ones that are more so common with neurotransmitters. Okay, you've probably heard of neurotransmitters when you were talking about neurology, right? And how they interact with a variety of signaling to affect the potential of neurons firing. And so that's exactly what the separate sensory cells do. All right, they decide which neurotransmitter is going to be released, which then messes with the potential, all right, the action potential, which can then determine if it's going to go faster, if it's going to go slower, or if they even have to stop it at all. And so each of those three have their own kind of job they want to do. And one of the things you may not realize that is occurring, and some of you may have, is adaptation. Okay, and that's when you decrease receptor response because you go through just a constant stimulus. All right, so this exposes you to having reduced action potential frequency. All right, so it's not going over that threshold hill often. It may still be going, but it's not going to go often. And that's why you fade over time. Like if any of you like hot showers, you probably when you were younger started not so much liking hot showers, but you start to see if you go over time, you've probably been increasing the heat of the shower, the temperature of the shower. And so you've been adapting to the temperature. Right. So people in Nordic countries, they go out and take the ice baths. They start when they're young. Their body has adapted also in the opposite direction to kind of correlate with the changes. Okay, so there's two different types of adaptation that allow you to do this rapidly and slowly adapting receptors. As their name sounds, rapidly they're going to respond quick, then they're going to instantly stop firing. Slowly adapting, they're going to continue firing as long as the stimulus persists. So as long as that stimulus is there, they're going to keep going, whereas rapidly stopped. Okay, and rapidly's going to detect changes in the stimuli. Whereas slowly adapting, they're just going to monitor the ongoing conditions. And they're going to decide if they have to kind of have this adapting. For instance, slowly adapting, if you've ever hurt yourself, accidentally cut your finger, you will adapt to kind of, in a sense, forget the pain, but it can come back. So those receptors are just monitoring the ongoing conditions to decide, you know, is there enough threshold for me to tell the body, hey, your cut hurts again, or can I just kind of let it sit by and maybe just have this like medium type pain? That's the burning sensation. Whereas rapidly adapting receptors, they can adapt pretty quick. Smell, right? If you ever gone by a waste plant or anything that kind of has that sulfur smell, you start to realize after a while, you don't really recognize the smell, right? It's almost like it's burned into your nose. You just don't smell anymore. That is a rapid adapting response. So this kind of all comes down to what is known as somatic sensations. Okay? And these arise from sensory receptors that are in your skin, subcutaneous tissue, skeletal muscle, almost everywhere. Okay? So these receptors are unevenly distributed, right? So they're not evenly distributed within a certain region, and they have a highest density in areas that need sensory discrimination. Fingertips, tip of the tongue, lips, all right, where you're gonna have tons of sensory, but you need to know and define what is what. So make sure it goes to the right central nervous system region to have a response. Now, if it's in the skin, these are called cutaneous sensations. Now, looking at all that, and that's almost all over the place, all right, we have four different modalities of these: tactile, thermal, pain, proprioceptive. Tactile sensation, exactly as it sounds. Your touch, pressure, itch, tickle, vibration, all that. They are detected by those mechanoreceptors we discussed. All right, so those ones that allow us to feel any tactile sensation. And it's really kind of determines it by these sensory fibers that they're connected to. Mostly, it determines by their diameter, so the size of those fibers. All right, if you have a larger diameter, you have a rapid signal conduction. If you have a small diameter, it's a slower conduction. You probably have heard of these unmyelinated A fibers and unmyelinated C fibers from previous. These can determine if it's going to have a rapid conduction of the signal or it's going to have a slower conduction, if it's going to keep it going fast or keep it going slow through the system. Now, most common, okay, of these receptors, more so if I'm looking down on mechanoreceptors, are touch receptors. All right. These guys, again, two different types of receptors. So they have the touch receptors, but they're two different things. And that's again your rapidly and your slowly adapting receptors. Rapidly, all right, that detects the change. These can be found in your fingertips, your hairy skin. Okay, and we'll see in a bit that it's actually within your hair fibers because your hair fibers move. And we have the slowly adapting. Now, those are just detect sustained stimulus. Okay, so continuous touch. You're sitting there, you got your hand on your desk. You don't just forget it's there, right? You still feel the touch and they still feel the texture. If it's smooth, if it's rough, that is a continuous stimuli. So rapid detects changes, slowly detects a sustained stimuli. And three of the main ones it can really help do is pressure, vibration, your itch, and tickle. It, pressure is a pretty deep, sustained sensation. It's detected by two main adapting receptors. Vibration, on the other hand, it goes one way or the other. Right? Whereas pressure is just deep and sustained sensation, continued, may be detected by two things, but down the same signaling pathway. Vibration has two ways to go, and this is kind of similar to the unmyelinated A and the myelinated C fibers. Diameter changes, whereas certain corpuscles determine if it's going to be a high frequency vibration, if it's going to be a low frequency vibration. So if you're at a concert and you're standing next to the bass system, that is a high frequency vibration response because you're just hearing the frequency of the bass hitting and hitting and hitting. But if you go further away, you're maybe half a mile away on the outside, you may feel the vibration still, but it's a lower frequency. Right? So that actually comes from these two different ones, which decide which way to go. Now, itch and tickle, this is strictly detected by free nerve endings. Itches will often caused by chemicals, actually. Histamines, if you have an allergic reaction, if you have poison ivy, this is a chemical reaction. So this starts to bring in the fact that you may have these tactile receptors, but it can also interact with other receptors. Because if you have these guys, you're having a chemical reaction, you go to itch that region, you start to mess with the tactile receptors. All right. So that's why you probably heard people, if you have, chicken pox, poison ivy, don't scratch it. You're going to make it worse. It's exactly why you're starting to mess with other receptors. And it actually reduces any spinal inhibition of the itch. Okay, so this helps, all right, the adapter receptors that involved in this whole thing. This is what helps you start to forget that you are itchy, and start to forget and adjust so that you don't furthermore interact with these sensory receptors. Thermal sensations. Okay, another huge key one. These guys are all done by thermoreceptors. Again, these are free nerve endings. Okay, so free nerve, free dendrites. And we have two different types, just like you'll start to see almost every specific sensation is going to have several, and it's all going to do different things. Cold receptors and warm receptors, exactly what it sounds. Cold, it's activated between 10 to 35 degrees Celsius. Warm, it's between 30 to 45 degrees Celsius. And what you'll also start to see is there's different fibers, right? So that myelinated A fiber is in the cold receptor, and that unmyelinated C fiber is in the warm receptors. Now, if we look back at that, it's a change in the frequency because we want a certain quick response to certain thermal changes. It's a way to promote homeostasis for survival. And cold receptors are the most numerous. All right, we are not designed to survive in colder climates. While yes, we can adapt, hence adaptation, we're not developed to survive in such cold receptors, and it can lead to pretty serious cell death. All right, so those are the most numerous when it comes to thermoreceptors. And now anything outside of this range, all right, the 30 to 45, the 10 to 35 between these two receptors, it's no longer thermoreceptors. It actually becomes pain receptors. Ever go out in the snow, really windy, really cold, and you start to realize your face is hurting. Right? You're cold, but you've gone past the cold, and now you're starting to feel pain. It's because it's no longer detecting the thermoreceptors. Just as if you decided to go out on a hot summer day, yes, you may be getting a sunburn, but it starts to eventually turn into pain. So the pain receptors become activated. And as such as pain perceptions, I mean, we know what pain is, right? It alerts the body to tissue damage. You want to know you're got some pain, you want to know there's some type of damage. Okay, and so it's got specific pain receptors, what I call nociceptors. All right, so those are again are free nerve endings found in all tissues except the brain. Okay, the brain is the only region that does not have pain receptors, and it's stimulated by a variety of things. Touching, right? So if I cut my finger, that is a mechanical stimuli. Thermal, like I said, cold out, too hot, that is again a pain receptor stimuli. Chemical, you spill some acid on you or you have an allergic reaction, it can cause some pain stimulant. But on the inside, okay, while the inside can have all those, it's the inflammatory mediators. Your cells, when you have a specific disease, inflammatory disease, they can release specific things that will actually cause internal pain. That's why a lot of the time, if you don't feel good, if you have something wrong, you can sometimes feel the pain inside. All right, so these receptors are everywhere. They're actually really important. While it sucks to be in pain, they're really important. But they adapt very little. And while there's disorders where they don't feel the pain because these receptors or nerves are no longer assistant or damaged, we adapt very little. So that's again why you have persistent pain. Like I said, you cut your finger, you're still going to have these receptors going. It's more of you're changing the frequency. So if I hit it off something while I had my finger cut and all of a sudden it's a really sharp jabbing pain, that is because it was a rapid response. But I don't hit it, just kind of have it there, have a band-aid on it. You still have pain. It's just a persistent pain that's very minimal. And that while you can feel it, it's just not as severe as if you would have whacked it off something. All right. And we kind of just talked about this, but types of pain. Fast pain, slow pain. All right. Smack my hand, fast pain. Don't smack my cut, slow pain. All right. Again, all comes down to these fibers. We have the myelinated A fibers that are with fat pain. All right. Unmyelinated C fibers that are with slow pain. It's your dull, aching, burning. Okay. And furthermore, they all have categories. And the categories are designed by location. Superficial somatic pain, skin, right? Sunburn, slight cut. Deep somatic pain, muscles, joints, and tendons. All right. So you're going out for a run and you pull your calf, right? Or you tear your ACL. This is deep somatic pain. Visceral pain, that is internal organs. So that's, if you go to the hospital and you hear anybody that has suffered any internal organ injuries, it will commonly be called visceral damage or visceral pain, right? And now something that we all have, but probably never thought of, is referred pain. And this is visceral pain that is perceived on the body surface. Okay, so a visceral pain that's making a superficial somatic pain. And can it kind of occurs between them both because of spinal cord segments. Now, for instance, heart attack, heart pain. All right, it's in a specific T1 to T5 of the spinal cord segments, which actually have nerve endings that go out to your left arm or your upper left chest. That is why commonly when they say if you're having a heart attack, you'll start to feel a change of numbness or pain within your left arm. Okay, so that is an example of referred pain. And now to kind of get just an idea of how actually intense referred pain is, these highlighted regions are different instances of referred pain. Okay, this is all dependent on which segment of the spinal cord is either being impacted or whatnot. Okay, so that's usually why they say, if you have a constant pain, whether it be, in your skin of your liver or your shoulder, sorry, you know, you may want to go get checked. You may want to see if there's something else. It's some type of referred pain. And how this occurs is nerve endings. Okay. You have your skin here. All right. You have the epidermis, the dermis, and subcutaneous tissue. Subcutaneous tissue has a lot of the deeper things, right? Deeper nerves. And now think of your nervous system as a spider web that projects outward. Right? There is intermingling synapses. There are interactions with other nerves, and what occurs is kind of like a crossfire, especially if they're coming out of the same location, like a spinal cord segment. And it goes up, goes through the nerve, and it hits those pain receptors. Sometimes it doesn't hit just the pain receptors, it will hit your tactiles, all right, your thermoreceptors. Sometimes, if you're having issue, you can oh, my shoulder's cold and my shoulder's hot. That is coming from referred pain, which is all determined on the spinal cord location. Now, proceptive sensations was not something that was really considered I guess, sense, you can say, years ago. Okay, but it is now, and it's actually extremely intense, and it's something we do without even knowing that's actually extremely important. Now, what proception is we provide awareness to our body for our body position or movement. Right? This is almost all subconscious, right? You don't think, I mean, you do think, I'm going to take my step forward, my left foot, but what your body is starting to do is it's realizing, oh, okay, you're starting to lose balance. I'm going to correct that. All right. So we start to have an awareness of our body position. So it's totally essential for your posture, your coordination, all that. And these guys, all right, instead of rapid adapting, these guys will all adapt slowly. It provides continuous feedback, hence why it took so long to walk when you were younger. In these proprioceptors, there's three major ones. There's other, but there are three major ones. Muscle spindles. Okay, that's as its name kind of says, it monitors the spindles, especially muscle length and the stretch. You don't want to stretch too far, obviously, right? And it's embedded parallel to the muscle fibers. All right, so the muscle fibers are normally striated, and onto the parallel side of the muscle fibers, you will see these sensation receptors. And that's all involved in your stretch reflex, right? So you're sitting there, you're doing your yoga, your stretch reflex. Tendon organs, or sometimes they're called Golgi tendon organs, I just call them tendon organs, that muscle and tendon junction, hence its name, right? Tendon organ, muscle and tendon junction. This will also monitor muscle tension, right? And it triggers your reflexes and your tendons, okay? And it prevents excessive force. So it's almost in a way there to help with any type of preventive damage that may be occurred into your tendons, right? So you don't obviously want to tear your tendon. But this also not just does that, it helps you relax. All right, so these will tell you your tension is too high in your tendons. This will promote a message, so forth, you can say, through your body, which causes muscle relaxation, rest on the tendons. Now, joint kinesthetic receptors, you'll start to see a pattern here with their names. They are found in joint capsules or the ligaments within the joints. These guys detect your pressure, if your joint is moving, if you're about to go accelerate and run, if you're about to slow down from running. They determine how much pressure and strain has to go onto these joints, as well as they need a way to protect them. And it's done a lot by inhibiting the muscles, actually. So all three of them really have this message interaction with one another, because obviously it's not just like I'm bending my arm, so it's just my muscle spin. It's my tendon organs are interacting as well. My joint kinetics receptors are interacting as well. So this is a very concept system that we just didn't even know was there. Now, oh, apologies. Looking further at it, okay, so as I had said, the muscle spindles, all right, muscle spindles. They monitor your length. They embedded parallel to the muscle fibers, which you can kind of see here within the structure, and they contain those fibers, sensory neurons or sensory endings, and gamma motor neurons. It's key there within the muscle spindles because those gamma motor neurons, that is exactly what the name sounds, helps to send the signal for that movement to can occur. Tendon organs located at muscle and tendon junction. They monitor that tension, they trigger the tendon reflexes. This causes the muscle relaxation by the compression of the muscles. All right, so changing the pressure, as you can see here. So think of it as kind of contracting it. Joint kinesthetic receptors. All right. Like we said, joint capsules, all pressures in joints. These protect the joints by reflexly inhibiting muscles under excessive strain. Right. And you can kind of, this in a sense is almost a combination of response between these both. All right, so these both are sending a message to the central nervous system through whatever nerve response they have or pathway, and it allows a message to be sent that we need to inhibit any muscles under excessive strain or allow them to rest and recover, and so forth. This is what kind of gives the message for your muscles to be repaired and grow. This is how you exercise, actually. Muscle damage is how you grow muscles, right? So this together kind of helps that signal. Now, somatic sensory pathways. Throughout, you heard me say first order neuron. All right, that first order neuron is a part of what is known as a somatic sensory pathway. And it's just the relay team that takes the information from the sensory receptors and brings it to the central nervous system. All right, so it brings it to that somatosensory cortex, and that allows you to have your conscious perception. Okay, or goes to cerebellum. That's where you get your unconscious coordination with movement. But it's all processed through multiple synapses, and it's these three guys, okay, associated with the sensory pathway that kind of get the relay stations going. All right. So think of it as a run, marathon run, but you have the table with the water bottles throughout. Okay, those are the relay stations. And as I said, the first order, number one, primary neuron, that is the sensory neuron. Okay, so it gets the sensory or the sense response into the neuron. That's when the impulse will start. All right, and it starts from receptors all the way down to the spinal cord or brainstem. And cell bodies located within the dorsal root ganglia and the cranial nerve sensory ganglia are what help. And they get it all the way down. And this relay all the way through allows it to enter the central nervous system. Okay, and goes on the spinal nerves. All right, it doesn't just go straight into the brain. It actually enters into the spinal nerves, whichever trunk, limb, head, any type of area within the spine. There are some cranial nerves it will go to. However, it's not the brain. It is the nerves within, your eyes, your face, and so forth. Now, that's the first order. All right, so it gets the job kind of going. Second order, or the secondary neuron, is an interneuron that's within the central nervous system. All right, so first order we didn't get into. All right, we finally at the end get into the central nervous system. Secondary order is when we're in the central nervous system, all located in spinal cord or brainstem. Okay, so that's where you'll find the secondary neurons. And the axons allow crossover to the opposite side and then to ascend to the thalamus. This is kind of one of the reasons you have um, issues on the one side, or not issues, sorry, response on the one side of the body being perceived in the opposite cerebral hemisphere. All right, so my left side of my brain is there to help any type of reaction on my right side of my body, and vice versa. This is why it occurs, because it allows the crossover, the firing of the electric pulse to the opposite side. So once it's gone through first order, it's gone through the second order, it gets into the third order or the tertiary neuron. This is located in the thalamus. So secondary order ended in the thalamus, third order begins in the thalamus. That's where it's located. This projects axons to the primary somatosensory cortex. So this basically was the endpoint, right? We wanted to get that there so we can have some conscious perception, right? So we can understand, I just touched a hot stove, that was pain and heat, I need to pull my hand away. All right, but again, remember, it's on the flip side of the brain. So that is all led by the secondary order neurons. Now, the somatic sensory pathways, while they lead to the cerebral cortex, they have a variety of pathways, and they each convey whatever specific sensation it needs to do. Okay, so posterior column medial lemniscus, it's PCML, I'm going to call it because it's a whole mouthful. That's where you get your touch, your pressure, vibration, some of your pain. Your spinal thalamic or anterolateral pathway, again, pain, temperature, pressure. Your trigonothalamic pathway, that's your sensations from your face. Okay, your nasal cavity, the tickle in your nose, oral cavity, teeth are hurting. And major somatic sensory pathways can lead to the cerebellum. All right, so remember the first up there, we're going to that cerebral cortex region. All right, but the major somatic sensory pathways can lead to the cerebellum as well if it needs to, each conveying whatever sensation it needs. All right, remember this is a lot of your posture, your balance, and your coordination side of things. And those specifically break down two pathways, anterior and posterior spinal cerebellar tract. Okay, now remember, those guys are not consciously perceived, but obviously essential. So the first three lead to some conscious perception. Now, looking at them, PCML, okay, it has a distinct pathway. Like I said, we talked about always begins with the first order neuron. All right, your first order neuron enters the spinal cord and ascends into a posterior column. So you can see here, right? Enters posterior column. It forms a synapse in the medulla, as we can see here. Now that is when the second order neuron takes over. Okay, and as you can see here, the second neuron takes over, but it doesn't go straight up, right? This is when it starts to pop onto the other side. Okay, and it forms the medial lemniscus, which, as every endpoint pathway the secondary order neurons want, is it makes its way up the spinal cord and into the thalamus. All right, so it's ascended into the thalamus. Now, this is when the third order neurons do their job. They project to the primary cortex on the side opposite of the stimulation. So, for instance, if I'm looking at this photo here with the person facing towards me, if they have pain on their right side, this is what would happen. Go up, flip on, or sorry, and pain on their left side, it would go up, flip up, and it would be on the right side of the brain. Okay. Now, anterior lateral or the spinothalamic pathway, they're very similar. All right, so the first order neurons, they enter the spinal cord. So they enter into the spinal cord, and you'll start to see by the photos, it's all in different regions of the spinal cord. All right, so we hit it in the medulla in the first time. All right, now what's happening is we're going in first order neuron into the spinal cord, but once it enters, it just kind of goes at the bottom. I guess you can say kind of near the tailbone. Once it enters there, the secondary nerve would take over, and the secondary neuron, and it begins to go up the spinal cord, sends the spinothalamic tract, and it forms a synapse in the thalamus. Now, third order neurons again will take over in the primary cortex, and it's again on the side exactly of the stimulation. All right. So remember, a lot of these pathways are varying because of the response they want to go, or the response sensory they're getting. Okay. So you may be asking, well, why don't all these three pathways go into the same region? That would make more sense. It's because they're responding in a way that the neurons may be firing at. Okay, so for instance, here we have a receptor for pain, temperature, touch, and pressure. It may just be, okay, on that person's right leg or right hand, they intense extreme amount of pain. They cut their hand. All right, it's going to follow this track. Now, I'm going to flip the other side. It's going to follow this track, but mirrored. Okay, so this all depends on the spinal portion they're going to go into, which limb, which part of the body. Now, the next one is the trigeminothalamic pathway. All right, again, very similar. The first order neurons, except this time, travel via the trigeminal nerve. All right, so first order neuron goes through the nerve, and what occurs is cell bodies form the trigeminal ganglia. Okay, and the synapse forms within the medulla. All right, so we have here. Finally, once it's in the medulla, secondary order neurons can take over. And it's exactly back to what it is. And you'll basically start to see the secondary and third order are almost identical. It really is that first order neuron that is the big game changer that decides which pathway it's going to go. Okay. Secondary order gets in, goes right on up, hits the thalamus, decides what the stimulation is going to be once it's in the cortex. All right, so remember the pathways are commonly determined or decided by that first neuron. Right? Secondary and third do the same job throughout. Okay, so yeah, that's cool. We have to go to that somatosensory cortex. Okay, cool. There's a lot going on in that cortex. Okay, and the location and the mapping of it really tells us a lot. Okay, it's found in the postcentral gyrus on the parietal lobe, and it's organized in a somotopic map, which is what I'll show you in a little bit, with each body region corresponding to a specific region of the cortex, okay, or the cortical area. Now, this is a disproportionate representation of body parts. Right? Larger cortical areas for regions that normally have more sensory receptors will have more room. Smaller areas, such as your trunk and lower limbs, will have less room. So it's really not like, okay, I have the same amount of brain for my arm, left arm, right arm, trunk, nose. It's all kind of disproportionate when it comes to the sensory receptors and their response. Okay. And any cortical representation is plastic, or it can change with use. It doesn't have to stay this way forever. It can change. It's kind of bendable, like braille readers. Okay. So they have to adjust and kind of bring in the touch feeling, but have this adaptation to the fact that touch is being used to read braille. And when you look at a picture of this is what it looks like. Okay, I know it's quite a disturbing photo. But if we take a corneal selection of your motor cortex or your somatosensory cortex, we see it's not even, right? This portion of your brain is your thumb, your eye, your nose, your upper lip, lips, lower lip. So this is really kind of where the somatosensory says, okay, I got this pain sensor. I think the pain is in my eye. I'm gonna go respond to this way. All right, so it's almost like a landing mark for this whole entire pathway to determine which is which. Okay, so now we're gonna dig more into how all of this goes into movement. Okay, and so all your voluntary movement is produced by neural circuits. All right, that's basically everything we've been talking about so far. And specifically, it's neural circuits in the brain and spinal cord. Right? And they all converge on different types of motor neurons. All right, we kind of talked about them in this in bones a little bit. One being mostly lower motor neurons. All right, those are the only neurons that will directly impact skeletal muscle. Okay, so it makes them the final pathway for movement. All right, so if you're moving, you're doing your thing, that's your lower motor neurons doing it. All right, so how this goes is what you'll see is each lower motor neuron that's coming from a different place does different things. Your brainstem lower motor neurons, those go to your cranial nerves, which then move the muscles on your face and head. So you're sitting there, turning your head, talking, all that. Brainstem lower motor neurons. But your spinal cord ones, those go to spinal nerves. That then brings the response to the muscles of your trunk and limbs, allowing you to take that step, bend that arm, all right, so the location those neurons are coming from really impact what's going to occur. And the big kind of difference between them is their structure. All right, lower motor neuron, oh, well, I guess you could say location as well. Lower motor neuron, okay, both the brainstem and spinal cord, the axons will exit, all right, to innervate the skeletal muscle. Right? So this final pathway, like I said, but it's not just the final pathway for voluntary. It's also the final pathway of movement for involuntary movements, right? Twitches. You're sitting there and your hand twitches, for instance. It's an involuntary movement, but it is still going to a lower motor neuron. Now, upper motor neurons, these are interneurons, okay? The cell bodies that are in the motor cortex or also the brainstem. So both of these guys will be in the brainstem. All right. Now the difference, like I said, lower spinal cord, upper is motor cortex. And these regulate the upper motor neurons regulate those lower motor neurons. Now it's either directly or through local circuit neurons, so an indirect manner, but it's all essential for actually planning and initiating the regulating movement. All right, so your upper motor neurons are doing the brain work. Okay, they're planning and initiating it, whereas the lower motor neurons are going forth and they're doing the actual work. They're allowing their skeletal muscle to move for the movement to occur. All right, so each of them play a key role. While lower motor neurons may be the final step, upper motor neurons are basically the key step in a sense. So, four interacting motor control circuits allow this all to do its job. First being the local circuit neurons. And so these are neurons that are near those elements, okay, in both the spinal cord and the brainstem. They bring in the sensory input and they get it up to the brain. The brain decides what the perception needs to be, and then these circuit neurons descend the command. So they have the sensory input, but they also have the response. Okay, and they coordinate your rhythmic reflexive movements, aka walking. Okay, so they help to coordinate that. As I had said, with upper motor neurons originate in primary motor cortex. So that's your voluntary movement. Okay, in the brainstem. So motor centers that help with posture, balance, and reflexes. These are mostly just synapses that are on a local circuit neurons. Okay, so they're interact with one another. Makes sense since both have some playback on one another. Basal nuclei, they modulate all the activity of those upper motor neurons. All right, and their way they do it is they modulate four major things. Okay, they help with initiating the movements by determining if it's going or not going. They help suppress unwanted movements, and they help regulate muscle tones, as well as influence any cognitive and emotional process. So this is not just motor control, right? Emotional processing, cognitive processing. So this kind of branches out on its role. And lastly, the cerebellum. All right, so this is basically there to say you're wrong, I need to correct this. All right, so it coordinates your movement by correcting your errors. If you think about it, every single time you are taking a step, you are bringing yourself off balance. It's your cerebellum that says, hey, whoa, we need to correct this error. We're about to fall. And which moves it forward to your balance, moves it forward to the next step to occur so that the balance stays there. But it's all done in such a fast manner that it actually just has it so smooth and precise. It's so well timed that you just think it's plain movement. All right. So this cerebellum, with all of that in its own individual roles, it's really critical for motor learning, your posture, and your balance. This is just a quick way to kind of think about it and more in depth on how it goes in that process. Like we had said, the local circuit neurons, they're in the brainstem and spinal cord. They get all the sensory motor association. They even get some feedback from motor centers in the brainstem. They really kind of bring it all in thanks to upper motor neurons from the brainstem. All right. And so that corpus striatum, way up here, also helps to receive the sensory motor neurons or the sensory response. And then it goes in two different places. Thalamus, which we've already seen, the thalamus plays a key role in bringing it up into the cortex, kind of decide where it's going to go. But it also brings it into the motor centers in the brainstem. So in a sense, the corpus striatum neurons are kind of feeding into one another. So sense, striatum, motor centers and brainstem. Motor center and brainstem goes back into the pathway. Cerebral neurons, those guys are there to kind of, I guess you can say, be the middleman. All right, so getting the response from the motor centers and sending a response. All right, so response goes in into the thalamus, into the cortex. Cortex tells its job, and it comes down to the motor centers. So each is super important within the endpoint of the skeletal muscle, and a lot of them kind of feed into one another. Now, we kind of been talking the whole entire time, is motor control is super important. And motor control is done within the cerebral cortex. not all, but it is done within the cerebral cortex. And if you take that cerebral cortex and you look into it a little further, it's got two key regions that we want to talk about, and that's the premotor cortex and the primary motor cortex. And it correlates to what we've talked a little bit about. Premotor, it develops the motor plan. Okay, I'm gonna take a step here, I'm gonna take a step here, I'm gonna take a step here. And it determines which muscles to contract. Okay, we're gonna need this muscle, this joint, and it orders them by the strength of contraction. Okay, I'm going uphill, I'm gonna start with my right leg because it's my strongest leg to kind of get it going. And it stores the learned motor patterns. Like that example right there. If any of you go hiking and you're going up a hill, you probably always choose one certain leg to go first. All right, it's just a stored learned motor pattern. Now, while that one does the brain work, it plans it, does what it's got to do, the primary motor cortex is who goes in and executes it. All right, so it executes that voluntary movement. So remember, this is voluntary. And each region controls the muscles on the contralateral side. Okay, I can't express this enough. All right, remember, neurons going in the left side, but the right side of the brain is going to give you the response. Same way with the primary motor cortex. All right, and now with this, it's organized in a couple further other regions. All right, specifically, one of the really important areas is our larger area. Okay, and that's because that's our fine motor control. All right, that's what is there allowing your hand to hold the pencil and allow you to determine this is what the word is I have to write in such a minute manner. All right, so that larger area helps to keep those fine motor skills going. Motor pathways, all right, just like everything else we've discussed, again, all electricity, all neuron interaction. And we have two different ways. We have direct motor pathways, indirect motor pathways, which further they break into other pathways. Direct motor pathways, as it sounds, it's all voluntary commands, right? And it all comes from the lower neurons. Two different pathways, okay? And they're mostly different because they associate with different regions of the body. Corticospinal pathways, that's your limbs and your trunks, okay? 90% of those fibers, well, they will go into the medulla, all right? And that further, tons of pathways, I swear. Two tracks, okay, down the corticospinal pathway, lateral and anterior. Lateral is precise movements of your distal limbs, and anterior is the trunk and proximal limb movements. Okay. Now on the flip side, the corticobular pathway is head and neck. All right, so that controls your cranial nerves and motor nuclei, and it regulates your facial expression, keeps you smiling, keeps you frowning, and it allows you to speak, chew, any eye movement you need to do, left to right, reading the sentence. So you see that majority those pathways vary by where exactly the response is going. Okay. Now, indirect motor pathways, exactly as the name sounds, it's indirectly done. Okay. It originates from our brainstem and the motor centers within. That's going to regulate your posture, your balance, muscle tone, reflexive movements. All right. It has several major tracks. Those that do balance, posture and muscle tone, reflexive head and eye movements, and assist finer upper limb movements. Now, direct motor pathways. Okay, so if you remember, two different ones. All right. And they they each go a different pathway. All right. Very similar. Okay, but there's very minute changes that occur. Okay. Lateral corticospinal pathway. All right. The lower motor neuron starts on the right side of the spinal cord. Right? And it goes up through until it gets to medulla, crosses over, goes on through into the cerebral cortex, into the internal caps, and all the way up. Okay. Whereas on the flip side, instead of going up the anterior portion, when it's the anterior corticospinal, or sorry, instead of going up the lateral portion, when it's the anterior corticospinal pathway, it goes on the anterior portion. And so instead of going this side, it goes on this side. All right, it basically does the same thing. You'll see the major differences are right here in the medulla. All right, and exactly where the neuron starts and if it's going to pop to the other side. Those are the main two differences that you will see, okay, and that you should know. Now, indirect motor pathways, very similar, all right, come in different portions. Now, this is showing several neurons coming in. It's very similar to basically what we saw previously. Lower motor neurons coming in, depending on the response that they need, whether it be balance or involuntary movement. It will follow that specific tract. Okay, so you'll realize it's going boop straight up again to the medulla, pops into the medulla, and it goes all the way up to the spinal cord, up into the brain. So the indirect motor pathway is very, very similar. Okay, it's just whatever response is needed in the area of the response is where it will enter into the spinal cord instead of it going, okay, I'm going to go to the lateral side, I'm going to go to the anterior side. That's the difference in the response. Okay, we talked basically about brainstem all this past 5 minutes. This probably more. Brainstem itself has motor center. Okay, and four regions of it. They have vestibular nuclei. All right, that's all your equilibrium input. All right, it's all what keeps your posture there, so you're sitting up in the chair. And reticular formation, all muscle tone and posture. Again, you start to see posture is a lot of it. Okay, and it balances any excitation and inhibition of trunk muscles. All right, keeps you if you turn your body left to right. All right, keeps your back against the chair, so you're sitting upwards. Superior colliculus is coordinates your reflexive head and eye movements. Okay, so rapid eye movement. It's actually there when you're sleeping and you're going through rapid eye movement. If I'm going to the left of my eyes, I'm going to the right, I'm going up, I'm going down. They are there to help. Now, red nucleus, that is precise upper limb movements. Now, it's very important if the cortical spinal tract is damaged. You're going to lose the ability to use your upper limbs, right? You're not going to be able to move them. This is where it's partial the paralysis comes from. Okay, so they each have their own important role, and this is where the indirect pathway they're going to go. So if I went back to that picture, you would say, okay, I have an equilibrium input that needs to go. It's the vestibular nuclei we're going to go to in the brainstem. Okay. Now, corpus striatum and the cerebellum, they actually impact the upper motor neurons. All right, I know we have like lower motor neurons, but upper motor neurons can also be impacted by these portions. All right. Corpus striatum, that's voluntary movements, right? Any unwanted movements keeps them from going. All right. So this is when, a little bit of Tourette's can come into play. Corpus striatum damage prevents the ability for you to suppress any unwanted movements or twitches. Okay. So your eyes twitching, it's there to help stop it. It helps to regulate their muscle tone, and it, of course, influences cognitive and emotional processing. So usually, if the corpus striatum is damaged, emotional processing is not very efficient, which can lead to a variety of psychology issues. Cerebellum, that's your intended movement. All right, so monitors that. So remember, cerebellum's there to monitor, assess, and correct and edit. All right, so cerebellum does all the monitoring of whatever you're going to intend to do, the actual movement, and it compares the two. All right, so it doesn't just, okay, I tend to do that. Okay, I did it. It says, okay, my intended movement was to go up with my right foot. My actual movement was go to the left. This was the error. Next, I'm going to go to the right, which then allows to kind of put that pattern into your mind. All right, so it gives corrective feedback to the upper motor neurons. And if you remember, the upper motor neurons help the lower motor neurons. So the cerebellum is kind of like the CEO, with upper motor neurons being the manager and the lower motor neurons being the workers. And as such, we're going to look at the CEO, right? And the modulation of it. So when you're looking at the cerebellum, it's kind of helps with movement in four ways. Okay, so it monitors the intentions for the movement, and that's done by it receives the nerve impulses. All right, so it gets the nerve impulses from the motor cortex as well as the corpus striatum via certain nuclei, and it assessed. All right, so you can see here in the red, or is this your cortex, down the thalamus. It's kind of just going down the normal region it was going to. And now, and you would normally, right, see it go all the way down to do its action. But what occurs is basically it's kind of like I'm going to proofread this and go to the cortex of cerebellum. Okay. And while that's occurring, it monitors the actual movement. Right. So whatever input it's getting from the joints, the muscles. It reveals what is actually happening to the plan that was just sent, hence the red arrows. All right, and it will travel in an anterior and posterior spinocerebral tract. Right, so you can kind of see this here with the blue. It's going up, it's going into the cortex of cerebellum to say, this is my movement, this is what I did. Now, it compares them, right? They're both in there. We got the red arrow, we got the blue arrow, both in there. Compares the intentions for the movement and the actual movement performed. Now, once it does that, it sends feedback. If there's any discrepancy between whatever was intended and the actual movement, it's going to send it to the upper motor neurons. Upper motor neurons, not the lower. And it travels via the thalamus. All right, so it comes out, goes into the thalamus, and it sends it to the upper motor neurons within the cerebral cortex. All right, so then once those upper motor neurons have been corrected, all right, given the feedback, they now know the next pattern response will be what the cortex of the cerebellum has told me to do. Integrative functions. Okay, so integration is just processing the sensory information. All right, so it does it in a way that it's kind of like a filing cabinet, analyzes it, it stores it, and then it can respond appropriately, which allows kind of responses to be remembered in a sense. And the major functions are your wakefulness and sleep, your learning and memory, and language. All right, like I said, it's kind of like the professor of the brain. All right, so these all rely on activity that's coordinated. So it's not just random, it's coordinated across the cerebral cortex, the limbic system, the thalamus, brainstem, and hypothalamus. So you're starting to see this is intense. All right, you're using a large force of your central nervous system to do these functions that we just think are normal. They just happen. Now, circadian rhythms, you've probably all have heard about them. We as humans, we follow a circadian rhythm. And what that is basically just a sleep and wake cycle or sleep and wake timing. Ours and other mammals is regulated by the suprachiasmatic nucleus of the hypothalamus. And what this does is it just determines when we should be asleep and when we should be waking. It's something we've evolved with for years on years. It's bright outside. I should be up. It's dark outside. I should be asleep. Or flip top if it is a nocturnal animal. And on the side of that, we have what is known as a reticular activating system. All right, so this is a part of reticular formation, and this is what gives us our alertness, our consciousness, and it's all kind of led by the cerebral cortex in the thalamus. All right, it's all done by pain, touch, pressure, movement, bright light, loud sounds. The only thing that does not activate RAS is olfactory input or smell. Okay, that's why odors often fail to awaken sleep in individuals, unfortunately, such as gas leaks, right? Even though companies put smells into gases, sometimes we don't wake up to it. And unfortunately, it does occur terribly. But consciousness is just that state of awareness that is produced when RAS activates. Okay, and we'll see there's differences in RAS, especially when we're sleeping. As mentioned, rest does kind of come into play when we talk about sleep or brain disorders, and we all know what sleep is, right? Reversible state of altered consciousness. It's super important for brain function and memory learning, but sleep is broken up into two: non-rapid eye movement and rapid eye movement. I'm sure you've heard of all of them. Non-rapid eye movement is in four stages. Okay, light transition, light sleep, moderately deep sleep, and deep sleep. Right? Deep sleep is difficult to waken. You ever waking up when you're really in a heavy sleep and you feel super groggy, you don't know what you're doing, and trying to catch up. It's your brain was at an altered state of consciousness. Now you're trying to jump right back in the wake. Okay. Rapid eye movement, you've probably seen the videos. Someone has their eyes closed, they're sleeping, and their eyelids are going back and forth because their eyes underneath are moving. Okay, so eyes are rapidly moving. Our EEGs would resemble wakefulness. We have high brain activity. So this is when your um, dreams are occurring, your heart rate is increasing, you're mostly paralyzed, all right? And you're just having a vivid emotional dreaming. When we're sleeping, we go in sleep cycles. Right, so we alternate between non-rapid, rapid. It's about 90 minutes, 4 to 5 cycles per night. Now, obviously, it's dependent on how deep of a sleeper, disorder, if you're going to wake up or not. But REM periods will lengthen as the night progresses. Okay, so as cycles are going and going and going, you will go into longer REM periods. Okay, and it's really important for development. Infants are about 50% asleep is going to be red. That's because infants are born, the brain's smooth, so it's helping the brain be developed. Now, sleep regulation is done by what is known as sleep centers. Each type of sleep has a sleep center. Non-rapid is the hypothalamus and basal forebrain. Rapid is pons and midbrain. Okay, and it's also held to be done chemically. All right. We all know ATP, right? Adenosine triphosphate. Adenosine accumulates when we're awake. It's because we're using ATP. And so it actually inhibits RAS. Now, when we're sleeping, we get energy, right? Our body is recovering. We're actually recovering a lot of our energy. So adenosine is actually being used. So it makes ATP, and in the process, it's decreasing its concentration. So it's allowing RAS to occur. And we all know caffeine, like it wakes us up, right? We love caffeine. I know I do. And what caffeine does is it blocks adenosine receptors so that it can't get in. It can't be used to make ATP, so the concentration doesn't really change, right? So it promotes wakefulness because of this. Now I have here just some examples about why cerebrum, sleep, wakefulness is so important. Um, Specifically looking at comas, other conscious disorders, we know what comas are: deep unconscious, little or no response, um, trauma, drugs, infection, actually damage of the RAS system can cause this as well. And now if comas get worse, we get into a persistent vegetative state. That is actually interesting because we have a sleep wake cycle when we're in that state. It's just we're not aware. All right, our brain's not dead. We still have EEG. Okay, so some of the functions of the brain are still there. Now, unfortunately, if we get to brain death, that is when there's complete absence of brain activity. So flat EEG. Okay, so our wakefulness, consciousness, and cerebrum really does have a strong impact on health and our function. Well, hopefully this slide sticks. Cerebrum helps with learning and memory. We know what learning is. We're all here to do it. And interestingly, it helps with what is known as associative learning. Okay, linking of two stimuli. This is why you've probably heard of people listen to music while they're studying. If they listen to the music down the line, they're more likely to recall facts. They're more likely to remember more. Okay, because we're associating two stimuli with one another. Now, non-associative learning is kind of the opposite, where habituation, we have a decreased response because we have a repeated harmless stimuli. Okay, loud noises, hot room, cold room. Sensitization is an increased response to a harmful stimuli. So it's kind of like associative learning. You study in a really hot room, it's uncomfortable, but then you go and take your exam, increased response because the room is hot. Okay, so kind of like that. And learning is all based off memory, right? And there's two different types of memories: explicit and implicit, or declarative procedural. Declarative memory is what you expect of memory, right? Recalling facts, events, being able to take your ABCDE test, and it all requires your ability to recall information, right? And more importantly, this is stored in cerebral association areas. Now, procedural memory, that's motor skills and habits. Okay, maybe you were trained how to change your own tire. 5 years down the road, someone pops the tire, you have to change it, all of a sudden you remember it. Okay, so it's a procedural memory that comes back. All right, it's stored in the corpus striatum, cerebellum, and premotor complex. Makes sense. That's premotor complex cortex because we need to have motor skills to do it. Now, memory needs to be consolidated, right? Because it needs to be formed, it needs to be placed, it needs to stay. Okay, and we need to convert what is known as short-term to long-term memory. So exactly as it sounds, short-term, we remember it for a short amount of time. Okay, if I look at these slides, I'm only gonna remember this information for a little bit. Long-term memory is where you really store, you really put it in there. All right, and the hippocampus plays a critical role. More importantly, for this course and just memory in general, repetition is going to enhance that. Okay, if I look at the grocery list my wife gives me once, I'm going to get almost all of it wrong. If I look at it 5, 6 times, then I'm probably going to get it all right. Okay, repetition helps and enhances the ability for it to consolidate, to put it to long-term memory. Now, neural basis of that is that memory is like a form of plasticity. All right, we actually change our neurons. We change their structure, we change their function when we're doing memory, when we're getting memory. All right, we're putting it to long-term memory. We increase synaptic connections. All right, so they're able to convey the response. We actually decrease connections with inactivity. So regions of the brain where maybe the inactivity, it's we don't need it. All right. And what this kind of leads to is known as long-term potentiation, or LTP. This is strengthening of synapses after repeated stimulation. Okay. It can involve chemicals, a variety of them, but it's thought to underlie learning and memory formation. Okay, so it's the long-term stimulation of these neurons, okay, that we change either structure or function from us developing a memory. Okay. Now, language in the brain is actually kind of cool, all right, because we just do it, think it's normal, but actually your brain is going overdrive to help you do what you're doing and help me do what I'm doing, okay? Because our brain has to recognize a bunch of symbols and words, and we have to be able to understand it and convey it. Right? And it helps with two areas: the wrinkles area and the Broca's area. Now the wrinkles area, that's the temporal lobe. Broca's frontal. Okay, and then the temporal lobe, that's where we interpret the meaning of spoken and written words. All right, so we see a word, it says temporal, my brain in that area is breaking apart what temporal means to me, and then translate temporal to basically a thought. So it's in my head because of this response. Now, in the frontal lobe, that once I understand it, I've translated language into thought. The frontal lobe, the Broca's area, it helps me relay the message back, say the words I want. And why it does that is it produces motor patterns. Okay, it allows your mouth to move, your vocal cords to vibrate, converts the thoughts into a spoken language. All right, and there's a simple language pathway summary there for you guys. And the key takeaway here is after all what I just said, it's the primary motor cortex, okay, that activates the speech muscles. All right, guys, that is it for this lecture. Just remember, you will have a quiz, okay? Watch both lectures. Both lectures will be in the quiz. And if you have any questions, don't be afraid to come to my office, okay, or email me, whatever you want. I'm here for you guys. All right, you have a good week.